Here we are at Clean Conversations with Caitlin and I'm with Charles-Louis. We're in Belgium.
Yep.
And Charles-Louis, I wanted to ask you, I've asked you this before, but I'm really interested. You took clean language. In a minute, just tell us a little bit how you got into it. But then you just took it and you applied it in all sorts of places. So in a moment, what I'm interested in is what is it about clean? But how did you discover clean language?
So I discovered clean language, I would say, by accident. So I was, I think the first time I heard about clean language was in a workshop with my good friend Tobias Mayer.
Yes.
I think you've met him, right?
Yeah, I like Tobias.
So he was doing this thing. I think it was Artful Leadership. Now it's called Thoughtful Scissors. I mean, it doesn't really matter. But at some point he introduced clean language, and I thought like, oh, that's a weird way to ask questions. Then we also did another storytelling training where once again he brought up clean language. Like he came several times with clean language, and I also discovered it through some other friends, also with Francis Laderman and so on. And then I think it's through another friend of mine, Noel Wanel, that I came across your book. So from contempt to curiosity. And so I thought like, okay, this is like too many, happenstances.
It's in your face.
Like, maybe I need to do something about it. So like I took the book, I started reading it, and like, okay, so that's the whole thing behind these weird questions. I mean, weird questions, because the first time about clean language, it is weird. And then I think that the key thing in your book is through the stories that you share, it really showed how actionable it can be and like how practical it can be in situations of working with human beings who have their own system, who have their own model, but like one can't guess just by looking at the person. Oh, so you're that kind of person.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what really got me into it. And then I experimented with it.
And so when you're experimenting with it, how do you know how... Hello, kitten. How do you know how to reuse it? Like, and I'll tell you, because some people, they learn it in context and they go, oh, you do it for this. Whereas you haven't done that. You've taken it and you've applied it in gender-based violence. You've introduced it to groups working with gender-based violence in the Philippines, for example, or in how to facilitate useful meetings in organisations. So how did you know how to reuse it?
I think I didn't, but I was like, this clean looks really, when I work in contexts that I don't know or I know nothing about, I'm like, well, I can't start, guessing stuff. So let's try and like use clean or apply clean to get a better understanding of it, of what's happening, of the things that I don't know. Because I mean, you talk about this group in the Philippines, Luna's Collective, and like first time I met them, I was like, hey, like you're an NGO that's working with gender-based, survivors of gender-based violence, and also women and so on. And like, I'm not a woman. I'm not. And I'm like, I don't know what it's like to live in the Philippines. I have no experience with gender-based violence. So like, I know nothing about all that. And I was like, the worst thing that would happen is for me to do your typical white middle-aged men telling you what you need to do. So then we started using clean, and they were like, wow, this is actually fantastic, because, so actually they told me how they could use it. So they said, we could really use this when we talk with survivors so that we can, I think the way they described this was we can stop empathizing with them, but they can own up their own story.
Yeah. So let me just check I got that right. So when you are in a situation where you couldn't know or couldn't predict or couldn't guess what's going on for them, then you've used the questions to better understand what's going on for them. And then the group's gone, we could use this to better understand what's going on for other people, but not to empathize or to, my words, mix my feelings up with yours, but let you own your own story.
Yeah.
Okay. And when you're teaching, what are the simplest things that you teach? If you want a group to get clean questions, what are the one or two simplest things that you teach?
So I teach, I think in one of the early conversations we had, I called them the Pareto questions, and like when this, it's like what, and is there anything else about X? You know, and because with these questions, it's really about like understanding the systems and the model. Yes, we can have the like, okay, and what happens just before, what happens after, but since the questions, especially if you've never done clean before, it is really weird. I like people to practice at least with those two questions, so that they can get the hang of it. And like, and so, for instance, a couple of months ago, I was teaching a class about group facilitation. And I asked them, hey, when you learn at your best, it's like what? And then like one person said, oh, for me, it's like walking and like I'm on the beach and so on and so forth. So the whole model came out. And then another person, yeah, and I'm just like her. For me, it's also walking. Okay, what kind of walking is that walking? Well, I'm walking in the city. Like, okay, hang on a minute, because you're walking in the city and she's walking on the beach. So yes, the walking is similar, but maybe so, and then we were able to unpack that there's lots of assumptions that we make when we work together and with groups. And when we are facilitating workshops, it's about making all of these hidden assumptions visible. Do we all agree on this? Yes, we all agree on this. Well, okay, but what did we agree on?
Yeah. Actually, that's a topic that I quite fancy for a future short conversation, which would be making the invisible visible. So we will come back to that one. So let me just summarise what we've got for people who might then want to just go away. So when X is something, X is like what? What kind of X? Is there anything else about X? Yeah. So those would be your
go-to questions.
The three go-to questions?
Yeah. Because for me, these three questions are, the advantage of having only three questions is like you can pick any of them and then move forward. But it also helps you remain curious and focus on, because the first time that, the people when I work with and when we start with clean, they're like, oh, but I need to be attentive to every single word they're saying. And then I need to figure out which question to ask next. And there's a lot of things happening in their heads at that point. So I'm like, just focus on 2 or 3 questions. Pick any random word. And like, so the whole thing is just practicing these questions, this fluency of the questions, and the curiosity, actually. Because it is about the question. It's not about the questions.
Yes. That's why I called my company Training Attention. It's what the questions do is they train your attention.
Yeah.
They train their attention on what their experience is, and they train your attention on their experience.
Yeah.
And so between the two of you become trained on their experience, not necessarily on yours. Or if you want to swap, now it's time for them to become trained on yours.
Yeah. And that was really funny because also a year or so ago I was also doing that with another group. And then they were practicing. And at some point we debriefed and how was it? And like one group said, well, it was very hard. So how so? Well, the other person kept answering with very short sentences, one or two words. And I'm like, okay, how come? Or tell me more. Well, and then the other person said, well, I wanted to make it very easy for you. We would only have short sentences, so you wouldn't have to remember everything I said. But then ultimately it made it harder because it was not a real conversation they were having.
And it didn't make the whole network of their experience.
Yeah, and so that was also super interesting also to listen how sometimes we want to be helpful. So we try to, I get where you're trying to go. And so we will, and ultimately it was wonderful to unpack all that and see like sometimes we want to be helpful, but we are actually playing against ourselves.
Against yourselves. Lovely. Yeah. Okay, so 3 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Especially useful if you're working in an area where you're not the expert.
Yeah, which is all the time for me.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm an expert in not knowing.
For some of us, that's most of our lives. Yeah. And have a go, practice, just use it. Okay.